I am honored to introduce our CEO at AAAS, Dr. Suresh Parikh, who is going to introduce the next session, which is on the new blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was very recently released by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And we have the speakers here. Great. So over to you.
Thanks, Teresa. Welcome, everybody. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to join you for at least a little bit of time during the meeting. I'm so excited to be able to welcome you to this fireside chat, this virtual fireside chat. We're going to get a fire in here at some point with people, actual people, on the OSTP blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights with Suresh Venkatasubramanian, one of its co-authors. I'm Suresh Parikh. I am the CEO of the AAAS and the executive publisher of the Science family of journals. And in the OSTP blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, it really addresses timely, critical issues around scientific responsibility, individual rights, access to accurate information, and public trust in science, all the things you all have been talking about today. These issues are, in fact, part of the reason why AAAS has undertaken a multi-year series of projects on artificial intelligence. These are being led by the AAAS Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law program, the folks that you know well. The projects engage the scientific community in dialogues just like this one on the potential positive and negative impacts of AI and the responsibilities of scientists in its research, development, and application. There are responsibilities for scientists here. We know that there are many opportunities for AI to help address big challenges that the world is facing and to improve individual people's lives. AI-based systems can warn of imminent environmental disasters, disease outbreaks, and conflicts. They're already being used to better monitor the effects of climate change, to enable more effective adaptation approaches. AI has the potential to remove human bias from decisions that pose risks for discrimination, has the potential to do that. Let's just say it that way. Or, as the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights points out, the ability to impose new discriminatory decisions that exacerbate inequities. And both those possible outcomes are likely. Achieving the positive impacts and avoiding the negative ones is going to require intentional and determined action by the scientific community. And this important conversation on AI and individual rights is an example of why we hold this annual conference on science, technology, and human rights. It's one of the reasons why we do this, because upholding human rights, especially the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, requires collaboration across all sectors of the scientific community, with policy leaders and with civil society organizations. In short, it's what our group on scientific responsibility, human rights, and the law program, it's exactly what they do. So I'd like to now introduce our esteemed speakers. Dr. Suresh Venkatasubramanian recently served as Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. He has now returned to his position at Brown University, where he is a professor of computer science and data science. His research on algorithmic fairness has received press coverage across North America and Europe, including NPR's Science Friday, NBC, and CNN, as well as in other media outlets. He is a past member of the Computing Community Consortium Council of the CRA, spent 4 years from 2017 to 2021 as a member of the board of the ACLU in Utah, and is a past member of New York City's Failure to Appear tool, FTA Research Advisory Council, the Research Advisory Council for the First Judicial District of Pennsylvania, and the Utah State Auditors Commission on Protecting Privacy and Preventing Discrimination. So you couldn't ask for someone more versed in this. And then engaging in this virtual fireside chat with him is Jeffrey Mervis. Jeff is a senior correspondent for science covering U.S. and global science policy. And I will add, having been on the receiving end of some of his questions, a pretty tough questioner. So I hope, Suresh, I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into here. So I'm gonna turn it over now to Jeff to start the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sudip, and thank you, Suresh, for joining us. at this forum. My understanding is we're going to talk for a bit, and then we're going to take questions both from the audience, if there are people in the room, and then virtually. So we hope we will have time to get into a lot of the issues you would like to raise. And I just want to say, just to add to what Sudip said about Suresh's very esteemed resume, is his position at OSTP, Assistant Director for Science and Justice, is a new position as far as I know of. And I think he may speak to that and the importance of those two words being joined in the course of our conversation. So let's jump right in. The Artificial Intelligence Bill of Rights lays out 5 principles that every American, and by extension, anyone on the planet, is entitled to. I wondered if, Suresh, you could briefly describe each of them and explain why they are seen as important rights for humanity.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey, and thanks to AAAS for inviting me to chat. So they mentioned, the importance of the work around AI and scientific responsibility. In OSTP, the whole team has been working very hard for a long time on these issues, especially the more recently announced, policy on public access to scientific research. So I'm very proud and honored to be part of that group of folks doing that work. Briefly, you mentioned my title. It's not so much my title, I think that's new, but the entire division that I'm part of, the Science and Society division, that was the creation of, at the time and now, Deputy Director Alondra Nelson, who really recognized the intersection roles of how science and society interplay and how we need to understand both of those interactions together. So I really want to credit her for that vision of putting this team together. To your question really about the Bill of Rights, there are 5 principles, and there is the formal wording in the document itself, but they really can be thought of very simply in the following manner: that automated technologies that impact people's rights, opportunities, and access to services should work, at the very least. That's not a big thing to ask. They should work and work correctly and be validated. They should not discriminate. They should not collect data willy-nilly without any kind of prudence or conservativeness. They shouldn't just be taking our data and using it for whatever purposes. They shouldn't be working in secret. We should know that automated systems are being used, and we should know how they're coming to their conclusions. And since all systems eventually do fail, it's very hard to get systems that don't fail. There should be backups. There should be human backups, ways that we can opt out of using these systems, ways that we can appeal the results of any process that's fully automated or partially automated and gain recourse for it. And that's what these do. And they work together. They're not to be thought of as individual things, but they form a collective whole that protects people from all the harms that we've seen manifest out of the unchecked use of automation in society today.
Okay, so the document is labeled a blueprint, which I assume was very carefully chosen. Some commentators have been disappointed that it wasn't more specific, that it didn't propose specific regulatory actions or legislation, in particular to rein in abusive practices by big tech. Is that a fair criticism? And if not, why wasn't OSTP able to lay down that foundation to go beyond what was a blueprint? And I should say before you answer, just to clarify for our audience, Suresh is not at OSTP now. He is back at Brown. And so he's not speaking for the government or for OSTP, but obviously he played a very essential role in developing the document. Go ahead.
Thank you. And yes, I am speaking only for myself and not for OSTP here. I think I view the criticism in a strange way as a positive. I feel like there was a lot of expectation, a lot of hunger for something, for some kind of positive statements about an articulation of the harms that come from the unchecked use of technology and what we need to do about it. So I think, the statements that the blueprint is not enforceable, does not have a legal authority, are all true statements. It is not enforceable, it does not have legal authority. But then again, it was never meant to be. OSTP is not a lawmaking body. It's not a regulatory body. It's an office within the White House that advises the president and coordinates government activities and articulates what, advises on what government policy should be. So this document is in fact a blueprint. That is correct. It is a blueprint for many reasons. It's a blueprint because we could have stopped with the principles themselves. We could have just said, okay, these are the principles. And there've been many documents like that over the years. But we weren't really satisfied with that. We weren't satisfied with merely articulating principles. We wanted to show how they could be realized in practice. And so the reason why the document is 73 pages long and not 5 is because we have very, very detailed descriptions, of where the harms are coming from and why each of these individual principles is needed. A specific and detailed set of expectations that literally a developer could read and think about how to implement within any system they're building. And examples of where some of these ideas are already in play. So it's not as if the document is going out on a limb and trying to propose things that are just not conceivable. They're very conceivable and very actionable. I think it's a blueprint that this is the basis for maybe more specific legislation, regulatory action, legislation at the state level, federal guidelines, agency actions. Because to be honest, it is very, very hard to think and reason carefully about something as cross-cutting as automation and AI, because it affects so many different sectors of government in so many different ways. You could have a somewhat of a blunt-edged instrument that said something very sweeping in broad generality about all of these technologies. And that would be, I think, valuable, but it would be very hard to make that actionable. And so the idea of being sort of a bit more specific and therefore recognizing that that specificity requires input from the folks who really know their sectors the best is why it's a blueprint with a handoff, whether you're working in housing, whether you're working in credit, or whether you're working in employment, or whether you're, working in any of the, or in criminal justice, for example, that or have some sense of what is important and how to realize the principles in your own specific domain.
I wanted to pick up on two things that you said there for this next question. One, OSTP's role, as you said, is as a convener and a forum to look at S&T issues across the government. So what were some of the conflicting viewpoints that agencies brought to the table? You had 20-some, I think, by anyone's count, that was involved in this process. And then were some of their concerns, deemed deal breakers and therefore didn't get into the final document because it just wasn't something that agency was willing to endorse?
So every agency signed off on what was in the final document. And when I say signed off, I mean at least reviewed, prepared their comments. For the most part, if their comments could be taken, they were taken. And there wasn't, it wasn't a question of should we, it was more a question of if we can, we will. And when there were conflicts, the conflicts were adjudicated. And I think, I would like to think that people came away at least satisfied that their concerns were heard, even if their comment directly wasn't taken. So what were some of the issues? It's phenomenally complicated. I will say, with all humility, that even though I had spent as an academic many years working on this, I didn't have the beginnings of the understanding of how complicated these issues are till I started talking to people who really know these issues well within government and outside. And so that I think that I want to double down on that point, because I think these are tricky issues, and there is a lot of expertise, a lot of nuanced understanding of the way in which automation gets used in different settings. And if we want to make sure we can keep the benefits of these systems without throwing, and as well as putting the guardrails, we have to understand and be sensitive to those nuances. So, for example, right, it's important to be able to evaluate whether systems are discriminating. But to do that, you have to collect data. But if you're going to collect data, especially demographic data, that now conflicts with sort of privacy requirements and legal requirements around privacy and data collection. How do you navigate these spaces? There are cases where you might want to give, where we've asked for giving notice of the use of an algorithm, But if you give notice and you give explanations of the use of an algorithm, is there a risk that the algorithm might be manipulated by sort of dishonest actors who want to subvert the point of using the algorithm in the first place? That's a risk. Is it a risk that's big enough to not have that principle? No, but it's something to keep in mind. So there are various tensions that had to be navigated while still saying we do want to have these as far as possible. So the document tries to be very careful and, to whatever extent possible, nuanced in accepting that there are different levels of impact, and then the guidance and the way in which the principles are implemented should be adjusted appropriately to the level of impact that's perceived. And that's a separate assessment altogether.
Yeah. I mean, did you have discussions in which sort of the technical experts, the computer science people felt you could say something, but then the legal folks, the general counsel said, it's not going to fly, or you might be able to do that in an employment sector, but you can't do it in a police, justice sector?
So I think, for example, some of the questions around how to evaluate discriminatory impact were very tricky, because I think even within the sphere of the law, and I'm a computer scientist, I'm not a lawyer by training, but talking to my colleagues who work in this space, there's a lot of nuance and subtleties and ambiguities in how the law thinks about discriminatory outcomes, especially when algorithms are involved. So having to thread that needle very carefully to not claim that all problems can be solved by what the blueprint describes, which is not true, or to claim that none of them can be solved, which is also not true, to understand that we're in this liminal space between where the law currently exists and where we'd like to go, and where we could capitalize on existing law to help us push us further, is some of the careful language we had to craft. And that was one example of that comes to mind.
Okay. Now, when you and I talked before this session, you had said that improving public trust in AI, will require the public to become more involved in the decisions that government and big tech are going to make about its use. What should that involvement look like? What kind of forms can it take? And is some of that already happening now? Can you point to some good practices?
So we talk about this a little bit. So in the principle on safe and effective systems, we talk about the importance of bringing the public in early, especially at the design process, right? The idea of stakeholder engagement early on, right? There's a line there that talks about consultation, that the public should be consulted in the design, implementation, deployment, acquisition, and maintenance phases of automated system development, with an emphasis on early stage consultation. There aren't, unfortunately, too many models of how this works. There are some, but there aren't that many. And I think this is one of those places where advocates and others have talked a lot about the importance of community engagement. And this is where we have work to do to figure out exactly how to do this effectively. I mean, the government regularly puts out proposals for comment and solicits comment from the public. That's good. But of course, what we're talking about is more, not just at the point of already having the system in place and deciding whether to deploy it, but even at the design process itself. So that's one example of how, the public, it's important to get the public engaged and to get interested, and especially people who are going to be impacted engaged. And we have to figure out the best ways to do this. And I know there's research about this, as work of thinking how to do this.
Now, do you see a role for public reporting strategies, like the adverse AI incident database, managed by Sean McGregor, for example?
I think very much. One of the sections for each of the principles is a listing of, why we need this principle. And it's a listing of all the examples of ways in which, harms have accrued to people because of the sort of lack of support for that principle. Virtually all of these are reports from journalists, from the public, from people who've experienced harms. And so this issue of public reporting, of exposing and understanding, is important, not just to show that this is happening, but to understand the subtleties and the nuance in these different use cases as well, to understand where the issues come up. I think having specific cases, specific examples says, A, that there's a problem, but B, that the problem manifests in a particular way in this setting that is worth studying and understanding.
Right. Now, obviously, as you said, the issues are sector specific, but they're also overarching. Are you concerned that having, 24 individual agencies develop regulations for their mission, whether it's education or healthcare or housing or the labor market, will lead to a patchwork of rules that are either contradictory or leave serious gaps?
So OSTP spend a lot of time talking with agencies together to make sure people were coordinated and thinking about their actions. I think there's a tension here. There really is, because the agencies know their mandates, they know their authorities best, and they are most well equipped to understand the subtleties and the nuances and how they need to go about doing their work. I agree with you that what you do need is some level of consistency. If it's one thing to talk about forms of bias mitigation in one sector, but not the same in another sector, that could be a problem. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I think it's a matter of experimentation and trying out what works. Traditionally, the US has had a sector by sector approach, and that has its challenges, but it also allows for that more detailed nuance. And I think it's better to have something that aligns with how people think about policy and regulation and see how far we can take it, rather than trying to impose something that's very different, and which then might be an uncomfortable fit. But I think these are both viable ways of thinking. It's really a hybrid approach that needs to happen. And where we go from the general to the specific is where the discussion is.
Okay. So last fall, when this was rolled out, the former OSTP director, Eric Landers, said government needs to set ground rules to, quote, reward people who produce safe, effective, fair, equitable products. Is there anything in the Bill of Rights that does that or addresses that?
I don't think the Bill of Rights has an explicit notion of reward. I think the sense is that following the guidelines and expectations gets us closer to realizing the vision set out in the principles. I would like to think that building a safer world where we can truly flourish is a reward in itself, but maybe I'm naive.
Okay. All right. So I think people would be interested in having you compare this with the EU's proposed AI Act, which translates the 2019 ethical principles into legislation. How do you think it deals with those issues, and what do you think of its suggested ways of regulating and legislating? You can take them one at a time because they're really separate issues.
So compare the AI Act, and you said regulating and legislating. Is that what you said?
Right.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Compare the two documents and then their effort, the first formula for implementation, I guess you could call it.
So first of all, I'm very happy that the two documents I mentioned the same breadth, because one is a blueprint from OSTP and one is an actual piece of legislation. So that is already good to begin with. I think that they are in some ways complementary, in the sense that the AI Bill of Rights talks about principles and talks about need to assess impact and look at different sectors and the risk involved in different sectors. And I think the EU AI Act talks explicitly about risk in that regard and talks about the risk of different technologies. So you could imagine in almost a handoff where you think of, okay, we want to satisfy these principles. We want to make sure we're doing the right thing. Let's look at the sector. Oh, in this sector, we have certain high risk things and low risk things. And that, you could think of the EU AI Act as guiding that as well. So they're in some sense complementary, but they also represent a different point of view. The risk assessment based approach that is very much how the EU AI Act thinks about this is thinking about, you have a piece of tech, understand its risks, and then see what whether you should be using it or not, and what kind of checks and balances. I think our approach has always been more rights based, thinking about what is it we want, what is it we think is important to protect people, and then only then looking at technology. Sort of the rights come first in some sense, and then the technology comes second, rather than saying the technology is a given and now we have to evaluate it. These are not, I think, strong differences, but they are differences nonetheless. I think another place where there is significant difference, and this is still evolving, of course, is the EU AI Act's desire to define AI and scope carefully what systems are under the purview of the AI Act and what are not. We made a sort of a deliberate choice at OHTP not to do this for many reasons. Among them, number one, the definition of AI is complicated. It's often adversarial. It's driven by parties with incentives to define it one way or the other, and it changes. Even in the academic world, it's evolved over time. And so, given how rapidly technology can evolve, I mean, as much as 10 years ago, people weren't really talking about deep learning in the public sphere as they are now, for example. We didn't want to, pin a document to a definition of a tech that could keep moving, because we felt, first of all, that's not a good idea to use a moving target. But secondly, that what was most important in all this is impact. If you're impacted, if your rights are limited, and the thing doing it is an Excel spreadsheet, it's as bad as if it were a deep learning system. It does not matter what the technology is if the impact is the same. And so we organized our thinking around that idea of impact on people, impact on people's civil rights, their civil liberties, and their opportunities for advancement and their access. So that's, I think, another key difference. We're not labeling technologies as in or out, or in scope or out of scope. We're saying we're not worried about the technology per se as much as we're worried about the impact of automation, because automation brings in a number of challenges around accountability, around transparency, opacity, and so on. And so that's what we're really focused on. I think that's a key difference between what the blueprint does and what the EU AI Act does.
So, but who will be responsible for assessing whether that impact is negative, whether it's occurring and needs to be addressed? Is there a place?
There is. And in fact,
for that to happen? I mean, and who would take the lead?
So that's already happening. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has been developing now for a couple of years an AI risk management framework. The goal of the risk management framework is exactly what you said, to assess risk. The NIST has also put out a special publication explaining their thinking around where risk comes from and what kinds of concerns come up with technology, societal biases, systemic biases, design biases. It's a very, very well thought out document. And so they've been working on this for a while. They have a very robust engagement process for building out the risk management framework. They have an initial draft and they're putting on more drafts. So you can think of that as sort of part of this. The blueprint lays out the goals and the principles and the expectations, and the risk management framework helps assess risk as well. And that's what I meant by saying that there are multiple ways in which the impact of the blueprint can be felt. It doesn't have to be just one thing.
So just if I can just sort of follow that. So if NIST provides this tool for risk assessment, then is it up to each agency to decide how to use it and whether to use it?
You mentioned agencies. I think of this document as going beyond agencies. It's for any entity that's building systems that impact people's civil rights. If a third party is building software that's used, by someone to do hiring, then that's still relevant for discussion here. But to your point, yes, and I think that's entirely appropriate for the entities who have the most knowledge and special expertise to be the ones thinking exactly how to specialize this in their own domain.
But then if a sector chooses not to make use of that, is there any way of stepping in? Do you think the government or somebody needs to step in to be able to protect the public if a risk has been identified, but the perpetrator, for whatever reason, is not responding to that? Then what happens?
So I would hope that, the existence of the blueprint as a point of discussion helps open up that discussion and create. And, oftentimes the problems, the challenges when government were not, many times the challenges are not so much, we don't want to do this, but we don't know how to do this. And I think the blueprint answers that question. If someone is unwilling to bring in the protections that this document says are perfectly reasonable protections to protect people, then I think yes, it's up to authorities with the power to force it, regulatory authorities, the public, the media, and others to bring pressure, civil society, which has done a wonderful job bringing pressure to bear on this, to bring pressure to say, look, it's not like we don't know how to do this. We do. Shape up and do it.
Okay. All right. Well, I would like to turn to questions.
I have one question from the chat. It just came in, and it says, if I heard you correctly, you said the US blueprint is rights-based in contrast to the risk-based approach of the EU AI Act. Yet it seems that most companies and State Department officials eschew the language of rights in favor of ethics. Is this not essentially the corporate accountability versus corporate social responsibility debate being played out again?
So I can't speak for what companies might choose to use in the language. I know that companies do like to use the language of AI ethics. We deliberately do not use that language. There's many reasons why. The State Department was involved in extensive commenting on the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. So they were, very much a participant in the development of this.
My name is John Gardner. I'm a retired multi-scientist, but my AAAS fellowship is based on my contributions to science ethics. So that's a framework for my question now. And this is somewhat new to me. So I'm going to reply or comment based on general principles. And my concern is quality control. We know that there has been a great deal of justifiable controversy over the past couple decades about replicability and reproducibility of research, and that problem has been addressed, but has not been resolved by peer review. Although much of it should have been, somehow that didn't work. The other thing is that I have a son in EPA, and I know he's involved in the science of the regulatory process, and I know that we have extensive opportunity for public and involved party commentary on any proposed rules or things. Those are both, in general, pretty good quality control measures applicable to science. I would like to know what quality control measures you are thinking about for this blueprint.
Thank you for that question. So a lot of what the blueprint talks about in the first principle on that system should be safe and effective tries to go into great detail on exactly the kind of quality control measures that you're referring to. In other words, how have you done appropriate testing? Have you done appropriate testing on the populations that the system is likely to be used on? Where is your reporting? Is your reporting transparent? Has it been done independently? Is there any kind of third-party validation of the system, the claims being made of the system? As we know, there's a lot of hype around the use of AI and automation in general. And often the hype doesn't match the reality when it comes to what these systems can actually do versus what they're promised to do. And a lot of the very detailed expectations, and not just the first principle, but in all of them, is really about, okay, you made this claim, prove it, and allow independent observation and do public reporting on it. So the hope is that all of that would incentivize the kinds of quality control checks, will enforce quality control checks, but incentivize good design and just solid engineering. That is really often what is asked for in these cases.
Training data plays a significant role in ingraining bias into AI. What kind of norms or regulations might be needed to promote effective and quality training data that results in AI that complies with the Bill of Rights blueprint?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And again, not to repeat myself, but I'll point again back to the requirements for safety and effectiveness testing, that this is a key element of this. First of all, what kind of data is being used? Has this data been quality controlled itself? Is it justifiable as appropriate training data for building the model? Has appropriate testing been done on data that's held out? So you don't just have the trained data, but you have the data that's held out for validation and testing. Are you testing on the right kinds of data? So there's a lot of details there. There's a lot more to do, of course, right? The blueprint is not going to spell out, what could be, a 2-semester course in sort of machine learning engineering. But I think it points the way towards something where a developer who understands the way to do testing knows what is expected of them and what they should be doing. So your point is valid, and I think that's definitely part of what the blueprint emphasizes.
Okay. All right. Well, let me toss out a couple of other things while we wait for additional questions in the queue. So, Suresh, are there any good examples of user interfaces at government agencies that provide, meaningful human control over AI systems? You talked about the need for, humans to be able to intervene or, to opt out. Are there such examples, whether it's digital cameras or navigation systems or something else that allow of human control?
To be honest, I have to think about that for a second, because I'm not sure there are very good examples. I think there are the beginnings of examples of this. There are, things where it's not, we're in the right direction. So, I'm actually looking at some of the examples that we tried to spell it in a 73-page document. It's hard to remember all of the examples. But let me see. There aren't, so for example, there are, this is, one example is in the customer service industry, right? So there's a lot of use of chatbots, right? So you book a flight and you want to change something in your flight, you're encouraged to go talk to a chatbot that will try to identify what your problem is, right? These systems are not designed to solve your problems. That is not the goal. They're merely designed to sort of address something very simple that can be handled quickly, so you don't wait online on a phone call for a long time, and then quickly route you through to a person who can handle your specific need. I'm not, again, I'm not going to say that they've solved the problem entirely, but I think they've got the perspective correct in that they're saying the goal of the chatbots is not to replace the human interlocutor, but to address questions where it would be more convenient and easier to handle automatically and quickly recognize when that's not the case, and then hand off the process of adjudication to a customer service agent on the other end. So this both reduces the load on the agents and also allows the customer, myself, to quickly change a flight if I have to. So I think that's an initial example of how, interesting design and just changing the way we think about handoffs and the way we architect the human system interface can provide some benefits while also providing this human backup.
Mm-hmm. So that brings to mind something else that I think Eric Landers said last year during the rollout, is that people deserve to know how AI has been used in decisions affecting, say, in this case, the type and level of government benefits they receive or don't receive. I guess as a layperson, my first reaction to that is, why isn't that already the case? Why is that now a black box?
Good question, isn't it?
What would it take to open it up?
Well, that's why the principle exists, because you can't even begin to question or ask anything about a system if you don't even know it's there, if it's being used invisibly. So there are two parts to it, right? There might be a black box that you know exists, but you have no way of looking inside. Or there might be a black box that's actually invisible. Both are problems. And so that's why the right to notice talks about knowing that the black box is there, but the right to explain says, no, it better not be a black box. There should be some explanation. And we do have examples of this. Again, they're not perfect examples. They're not even very strong. But when you get a bad credit report or you get denied a loan, you are entitled to ask, why was I denied this loan? What are the reasons for it? Now, the answers may not always be satisfying and they may be perfunctory, but there is a precedent for saying you do have it is reasonable for you to have the expectation that a system explains why a decision, especially an adverse decision, was made about you. So I agree with you. These should not be black boxes. It's ridiculous that they are.
Well, do you, again, I don't mean to put you on the spot to speak for the whole discipline, but do you think computer science community hasn't paid attention to that or hasn't made that an important, priority? They're just creating it and then handing it off.
I think
whoever's using it?
actually, I think the community has begun to make this a priority because of the questions being raised by journalists, by folks like yourself, saying, "Hey, why is this a black box?" There's an entire discipline around questions of interpretability and explainability that basically ask, how can we make these decisions more accessible and more understandable, or rather, how can we build models where the decision is easy to understand from the very beginning? So there's research on this already. So I would say computer scientists and the field at large has begun to ask whether this would have happened without this push. I don't know. So the push definitely helped, but it has helped push people. And the way I think about it as a computer scientist, that we have a lot of incentives and ways in which we choose to ask certain questions. And I think a lot of these discussions are helping people change the incentive to questions around societal benefit, around lack of bias, around transparency, but still apply all the tools and all the tricks of the trade we've learned as computer scientists in this context.
Okay, before we go to the audience, I wanted to just follow up again. Do you think, based on what you've seen, that the government needs a restructuring of current agencies, new entities to deal with these issues if they haven't been sufficiently recognized as sufficiently important? Do agencies need a new office? Do they need a new something? Did that come up during the discussion? And if so, sort of what was the reaction?
So I feel like when the time of day is an even number, I feel like the agencies need sort of their own office of AI, of AI, responsible AI, to think through this. When the time of day is an odd number, I feel no, that's too much. I honestly am not sure. I think there are good points, there are good arguments being made on both sides of this argument. I'm not entirely sure myself.
Mm-hmm. Because, as you know, I mean, the government has a penchant for, if there's a need for more research security, all of a sudden we have a chief research security officer. Right. If there's a need for data management, we have a chief data management officer. Do we need something like that explicitly, to make sure, as I've heard people say in other fields, from the minute I wake up till the day, the minute I go to bed, that's all I'm thinking about. And as the head of the agency, I want someone whose only job is that.
Well,
even though I want them to,
I'm going to declare it an even minute now and say it wouldn't hurt to have that.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's not enough just to do that. I think their roles, lines of responsibility, how the governance works, what kind of authorities they have, I think all of those things need to be figured out as well. So that's why I'm saying it's helpful, but it's not the only story. And I see we have someone patiently waiting.
Okay.
Thanks so much. It's a fascinating conversation. And I don't know if this goes back to your safety and effectiveness, your first pillar, but nothing's come up around the impact on climate change or sustainability or the kind of energy that is needed and drives these systems and that kind of harm, and not to move away from human-based harm, but what considerations went into that in terms of the blueprint, and how did you work through that, and how did you do so?
Yeah, so I mean, OSTP has an entire division that thinks around issues around climate and concerns around climate and energy usage. So there's a whole portfolio around that as well. I think I want to say that at some point we had, again, this is a long document that I don't fully remember at this point, but I think it's a concern. I think we were definitely focused on the harms to humans, individuals, and communities. I agree with you that harms from lack of sustainability are a broad-based harm to the planet, to society as a whole, that are worthy of consideration. I think it was also a question of how much you wanted to put into scope as well. But I totally agree with your concerns with, especially with these large, very sort of energy-hungry deep learning systems that get used a lot.
Okay.
Hello.
Looks like there's another question.
Yes, sort of a question and a comment and a question. So comment, just FYI, speaking about NIST. NIST has kindly supported work by AAAS to develop educational materials for judges on AI. And that's a project that we basically just completed. But number two sort of question, you asked about agencies, but government agencies. But at one point, there were at least two sort of public comment or public listening sessions. I believe they were in late 2020. 2021. Could you talk more about that and what, if any, the impact of those comments that you received may have been? Because I know we just discussed all the agencies that were involved in the USG, but what about the public in general? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to are the 2 listening sessions that were conducted in support of the request for information about biometric technology. So the request for information was put out, I'm trying to remember, was it September or October, around that time? And as part of that, a part of OSTP's sort of interest in getting real outreach and consultation with the public, 2 listening sessions were held where anyone could just come up to Zoom and say their piece for a couple of minutes and express their points of view, and also submit in written. So the listening sessions and the written commentary were all collected and distilled into a report that was commissioned by OSTP and conducted by a third-party agency, the Science and Technology Policy Institute. That report is available on OSTP's website, and it summarizes the listening sessions and the concerns people had. It was very helpful. I mean, I was at these sessions and I helped organize them, and they were very informative precisely because we could hear from individuals, we could hear from people who had specific use cases, both of harm and a benefit as well, of the values of using biometric technologies, which I think is important here to understand. And that provided a much more contextual and nuanced picture of these technologies. And again, the goal is not to sort of ban them all or use them all. It's to understand where and how and under what circumstances and with what protections. And these discussions and the RFI responses and many other one-on-one engagements are incredibly useful in shaping how the blueprint came to be.
There's one more in the chat.
Okay.
3 more.
Several. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you want to read those?
Yeah. So the first one says, you mentioned AI and automation, similar but different?
Well, my cheeky answer to that is yes. My better answer to that is they are similar but different. I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like I said, think about scoping. And, when we came to the conclusion that impact, was clearly the issue that people were most concerned about in their lives, how they were being affected. It wasn't so much about AI, but of course it was largely about AI, because AI has been data-driven automation has been the tip of the spear in sort of deploying these technologies everywhere. So it's we have a section in the report that talks about what you mean by automated systems, right? And we sort of highlight that, a lot of this is data-driven systems using machine learning or AI, but it's not the whole story. And that's, so I would say, yes, they're similar but different. We're thinking of a broad scope, but then focusing on impact as the test for when the scoping sort of kicks in.
The next question from the chat is, what kind of societal risks are posed by inherent weaknesses in AI systems, such as prompt injections?
Yeah, so for those who, this is a bit more of a technical term, right? Prompt injections are ways in which you can essentially provide inputs to the AI system to cause it to behave in an unpredictable and often harmful way, right? So, you put weird stickers on a stop sign, and your self-driving car gets confused and thinks it's actually not a stop sign and goes right through it, for example, right? And so it is a risk. And, again, going back to testing and validation. Now, to be clear, it's not, I don't think it's possible to test for every single kind of potential risk. But if you can imagine it, you should be able to test it. And since research has shown the risks of these kinds of prompt injection attacks, that should be something that's put into the arsenal of testing before a system goes out and is deployed in public.
Right, and it looks like there's one more in the auditorium and then another in the chat.
Yeah, hi. I wish I had read the blueprint before I asked the question, but okay. A lot of concern about the impact on employment because of automation and AI. And I wonder how the blueprint addresses this, and would love any inspiration you have from listening to hours and hours of testimony and reading everything. And what are the most helpful guidances you've seen on handling the impact on employment going forward with all that AI brings?
Thank you. Yeah, the document is only 73 pages long. So of course, no, I'm kidding. So there are many dimensions to the concerns around hiring. And I think hiring was a component that was always in the mind of the folks when we were developing this document. It's an important component. We had, very, great partners, Department of Labor, the EEOC, and other groups. So thinking about this. So there's issues around, automation as a vehicle for job replacement. I'm going to set that aside for a second now. there's the use of AI in actual hiring process. And that a lot of the discussion that comes up here about discrimination, about explanation, about recourse are relevant to that entire process, right? How hiring is done. And then there's also the use of, technologies like surveillance on workers. And that's also called out in the data privacy sort of principle on the use of continuous surveillance that creates a hostile working environment for workers. So there's lots of issues where, broadly speaking, around the use of AI in employment that are of concern and have been addressed or mentioned at least in the document. I think, if you were asking about sort of big picture, I think it's, again, I don't want to sound like a track record, but it is very complicated, right? I mean, there are places where, maybe, AI, and other data-driven technologies can help improve working conditions. In fact, a lot of companies claim that that's why they're doing, mass surveillance to improve working conditions. If that were true, that would be nice. Often that's, the problem is often that's a pretext for something else altogether. And I think that's where the issue is. The challenge is there are genuinely reasons to use AI and other technologies to help people. And if we were to do that, that would be great. The problem is they're often used as an excuse to do something else entirely. And that's where the concerns come in. And that's where I think public accountability and demands for transparency can really help a lot.
Well, I think that that tees up that I wanted to ask Suresh and also give him a chance to toot his own horn, as it were. You at Brown, you are helping to stand up a new center on computing for the people. It's part of a larger data science initiative. Could you talk a few minutes about the goals of that center and the initiative and how whether they address some of the things you've just been talking about?
Yeah, so now that I'm back at Brown and helping set up a Center for Tech Responsibility, and I think the vision of the work of the center really fueled by both the time I've spent working in the space the past decade, but also my time spent in government, just seeing the breadth of use cases and concerns is really three-pronged, right? So the mission really is to make sure that we can redesign and reimagine technology to speak for all of us, including all of the people who have been left behind by technology. We can do this in many ways. We need better research. We need more research that allows us to change the way we ask questions in computer science, right? Even the idea of saying, hey, let's try to build a system that optimizes for fairness and not accuracy is already a step forward. But we can do much more along those lines, and we can imagine more, because computer science is an infinitely creative field. We just have to harness that creativity. We want to educate, armies of students who are going to go out in the world and be technologists and be sort of enlightened technologists, if you wish, to go out and do that work of building socially responsible computing efforts. We want to train students who might, one day be overseeing technology or evaluating it, even if they don't have technical expertise themselves, to feel like they can ask the questions they want to ask and expect to get answers. And we want to act, right? Researchers, especially academics, often are content with, writing their papers and putting it out in the world and hoping for the best. I think we want to do more than that, right? We want to act and we want to be, affect change in the world, especially right now where there's a moment when we might be able to do something, build a better future with tech. So that's what, I have a lot of, my goals are very lofty. If the center can do, 1/10 of what I want, I would be happy. But that's part of a broader initiative within Brown University with the Data Science Initiative, which is thinking about the use of data across campus and across different disciplines. And it sort of gels with Brown's entire ethos of scholarship in the public interest, I think, and Brown has been a hospitable place for doing this kind of work.
Okay. Are there any more questions in the chat? We have a couple of minutes if there are.
There's one more that I can see. It says, are government officials and private technology executives adversaries or partners regarding implementation of AI?
So once again, my one-word answer is yes. My more-word answer is, it depends on the context. There are times when government and industry work together. Maybe not, always to the benefit of the people who are being impacted. There are times when government correctly plays an adversarial role against private technology, and that's how it should be. And there are times when there are opportunities to work together. There are genuinely opportunities to work together to benefit everyone, and there's no need to be adversarial about it. Like, I think a lot of the guidelines that we talk about in the blueprint around effectiveness testing are not unreasonable at all. If you ask any ML engineer, they'll say these are not unreasonable things to do, and we should be doing them. So there's no reason why it has to be an adversarial relationship for many of the things that are being asked for. But when it comes down to incentives and what the incentives are, sometimes along with the cooperation, you do need a little bit of a threat. And so in that case, sometimes it's appropriate to be adversarial. I think what we don't want is governments and private companies working together against what the public interest is. And I think we've seen models of that, and we don't want that.
Okay, a final question, a short one. Suresh, you're gone, but some of your colleagues have stayed. If people who are listening in the audience or on Zoom want to make additional comments or reach out to people with suggestions and ideas, who should they contact?
So if I'm not mistaken, the email address ai-equity@ostp.eop.gov works, and I can verify that. My colleagues are amazing. I'm very sad to have left them. They're doing amazing work, and they're continuing to do it. So the work is ongoing. It's a work of many, many people. I was but one of them, all under the leadership of Alondra, Deputy Director Alondra Nelson, who is amazing in every way possible and whose brainchild this is. So the work is ongoing. So please email OSTP. OSTP is very much interested in hearing what people have to say, and they take the feedback that they get very seriously. I know that's been the policy all along. Okay. Well, I think that draws our session to a close. I want to thank everyone who listened. I want to thank Suresh for giving his time, and I hope people learned something. So I will turn it back. I don't know if we're the last item on the agenda or not, but we are within our 1 hour.
Thank you. Thank you. You are the last session today. So here in the building, we're moving on to a reception, but thank you so much. And this has been a very enlightening end to the day, where we've been talking about scientists working with journalists who are covering human rights issues and science in the public interest, publicly engaged science. And we'll be continuing these conversations tomorrow. So thank you for being part of it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.